Well, good evening. I hate to interrupt the slideshow. I know that's that's a great way to start off. It's a good highlight. But we're so glad that you're here, and we're excited about having Dr. Richard Howe here with us. We're super blessed that he was willing to come. He's heading to some other conferences after this, so we were glad to get him in before his semester starts, which I guess is in a few weeks. He's the provost at Southern Evangelical Seminary, the Norman Geisler Chair of Apologetics and Professor of Apologetics and Philosophy at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And his dissertation was on a defense of Thomas Aquinas's second way. So if you've been interested in that for a long time, then then he will be glad to share that with you. So I'm sure it's great reading. Great reading. Anyway, why are we doing this? We certainly recognize everything going on in our culture. It's happening so quick we can barely keep up with it. And if you get caught up in all of the symptoms of it, it seems like there's just 1,000 different issues hitting us. But if you go to the root of it, it really comes down to a rejection of absolute truth. And once truth is out the window, it's really anything goes, and that's what we're seeing. Because you have no foundation, you have nothing as a standard, and so whatever your imagination comes up with is just as valid as anyone else's. And so Scripture tells us, set apart the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. And that's 1 Peter 3:15. And certainly we want to equip people to know how to think biblically and know how to defend their faith and be able to share. If it's not an issue with you, there certainly will be someone in your family or a younger person who will be asking some big questions, and we want to try to give you, equip you as much as possible to be able to answer those. So we're super excited to have Dr. Howe here. He's a graduate of Mississippi College, has a philosophy degree from University of Mississippi, or Mississippi University? Ole Miss. And a and it gets worse. And a PhD from University of Arkansas. So, thankfully he has no degree from the University of Alabama. Otherwise, we would have had to find a different speaker or do a baptism in the LSU lakes or something. I don't know. We do have some... he has some resources from Southern Evangelical Seminary out there. Also, we have these cool little notebooks if you want to take notes. The Lord willing, everything that he shares tonight will also be up on our website or his website later on. His website is down right now, but we're hoping to get it up soon. But I'm going to, oh, wow, everybody's leaving. What did I say? Did I insult somebody? Oh, I shouldn't have pointed them out. Okay. Anyway. Plan is to have the session tonight responding to popular atheism. Q&A will start taking place around 8 o'clock tonight. We'll see how that goes, hoping to end around 8:30. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock is responding to relativism and then responding to religious pluralism a little bit after that. And then we'll end around lunchtime tomorrow. And then if you want to come back, Sunday morning services, we have 9, 10:45. He'll be speaking on Introduction to Apologetics, How to Defend Your Faith, and then Sunday night, The Truth About Truth, Building a Biblical Worldview, which is really aimed more towards youth and young adults. So we encourage you. And if you're joining us online, super great to have you, youtube.com 516 Church or facebook.com 516 Church. And we do have some resources as well, some videos that can help you know how to process this afterwards and maybe talk to a friend about it as well. I'm going to open up with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Richard Howe. Father, we give you praise. Thank you for the fact that you are the truth and that your Son, Jesus Christ, is the way, the truth, and the life, and that your Spirit is the Spirit of truth. And I pray that you will set us apart by your truth and sanctify us and equip us so that we can not only know the truth, which is found in you, but also defend it. And Father, we do pray that you would open up doors of ministry. Help us not to be intimidated. Help us not to be ashamed of the gospel. But, Father, strengthen us in our faith and use us for your glory. Thank you for Dr. Howe, and just continue to pray you'll use him and pray that we'll just be blessed tonight, and you will encourage us as we hear more from your word. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, if you believe in the sovereignty of God, after my being humiliated with my association with Ole Miss, you notice the color of my tie. So I'm just saying. So there are no coincidences, right? As one of the memes said up there. Now, if you know the answer to this, you can maybe raise your hand, but don't say it out loud. But we just saw a whole bunch of jokes scrolling through, right? This is also a joke, but it may be more subtle than any of the others. So who already gets the joke there? I'm just curious who might, because if I remember, I'll tell you before the evening's out, or if someone else remembers, you can ask me and say, what was it's not that funny. It's just sort of an irony, perhaps. So think about that. If anybody gets that or doesn't, let me know. All right? Now, I didn't see any hands, by the way. So maybe that just means you're humble. Don't say it. Don't say it out loud. Don't give it away. Let them percolate on it for a while and stuff. So we're going to talk about atheism right off the bat. Probably a good reason why we're doing that for the weekend is that when we talk about truth, Steve's already brought up the fact that this erosion of truth has led to some of this nonsense that we couldn't even imagine. We were having discussions about can men be women and things like that. So I thought it's probably easier to start with something that most Christians would be so obviously false as atheism, and work back from that in terms of seeing principles that undergird why some people might be atheists and how the argument goes. And the principles maybe are easier to see when the subject you're talking about is already so easy to see. Does that make sense? And then that'll allow us, as we go tomorrow, into things a little bit more subtle about truth itself, especially truth with respect to many religions in the world and these kind of things. Now you might wonder, well, why are you doing something Sunday morning? These are for the members here who probably will be here Sunday morning. Why are you doing now an introduction to apologetics at the tail end of a conference where you've been doing apologetics? That seems like you've got it backwards. And there, what I hope we can all see who are going to be able to come is, first of all, if you are here for all the sessions, then Sunday morning will kind of tie together what look like really disparate topics: atheism, religious pluralism, epistemological relativism. Can you say that in church? Can I talk that way? You know. It'll sort of tie it all together, the sort of big picture. And of course, if you show up, if someone shows up, maybe didn't get to hear all the sessions, then they're again going to see, well, what is this whole apologetics thing? What does that even mean, and why does that matter to me as a Christian? All right? Now, Steve's already told us that we're going to do a little bit of a session, and then we're going to do Q&A. Now, generally what I lobby for is just do Q, because you get a whole lot more questions in. You know, but sometimes we have to do the A. And also, just to let you know, if I fall off these steps, then we just get out early tonight. Okay? We just go get some coffee or whatever. Just make sure I'm okay. All right, so don't let me forget. I'll tell you about this joke. Now, another thing, just to let you know, a little housekeeping. Over the years, I've generated a lot of PowerPoint presentations for the courses I teach at the seminary and opportunities to speak like this. And I take those presentations and I convert them into PDF files, and I've been putting them on my website. So I invite people to go to my website to get the PDF files for two reasons. Because whenever I do a presentation like we're doing tonight and tomorrow, invariably a lot of the slides are just skipped for the sake of time. Because a lot of those are in classes that last hours, right? So you don't want to endure, people have to endure that. So you can get the other slides, for example. Also, there may be a reference where I quote some scholar, some atheist, let's say, but it goes by kind of fast and you didn't get to write down, well, exactly where did he say that kind of thing. So you can go get the PDF slide deck and you can find out what book that was from and that kind of thing. But I want to warn you about something. It's very likely that if you get a PDF slide deck of a PowerPoint presentation of a lecture you haven't heard yet, then there's the danger there's going to be a slide or two that you have no idea what the point is. It's like, oh, I don't even know how that fits in. So what that's tempted me to do, though I haven't really done this, so this joke won't work on you guys because you'll already know, but it's tempted me to just take some of my presentations and just put in totally irrelevant pictures right in the middle and see if anybody calls me and go, yeah, you know, let's look at your existence of God thing. So exactly what is that kumquat argument for God? I think I can get a lot of purchase with that one, because I love kumquat, so if I can work that into an argument. So at any rate, so don't assume. I haven't done that, so it probably has some reason for being there. So here's how to get to my, right now, non-functioning website, okay? So don't try it right now. You'll just sit there and never. But here's how to get to it here. Here we go. RichardGHowe.com. All right, don't leave out the G. Stands for good looking. Why did they laugh? Why is that funny? Everybody laughed. RichardGHowe.com. And you'll see at the top these resources right there, tab. Click on that. That'll take you to really 5, I'm showing you 4 right now, resources. If I happen to mention, hey, I've got a paper on my website, this is where you'd go. Click on papers. Papers I've written, papers other people have written, links to things on the internet, Bible, theology, philosophy, apologetics, that kind of stuff. Same thing, multimedia, some stuff I've done, other people done, links to things people done on the internet. Midway Community Church, I bring you greetings from Midway Community Church in Alpharetta, Georgia. I live in Cumming, Georgia, as far north as you can be from Atlanta and still be the Atlanta area, all right? Greetings from the saints there. They're praying for this weekend. There at Midway. It's stuff I've done in my church. You're welcome to go get some of that. Hopefully that can be helpful. There's also one that wouldn't fit on the side. It's where I've just basically gathered together just the multimedia that is my own. There, excuse me while I take a strategic sip of coffee. That's called a dramatic pause. So don't try this at home though, because I am a professional. Okay, so under medical supervision. So all of the stuff that's just debates, I'm still populating that, just panel debates or other kinds of things. So if you have trouble falling asleep one night, you might want to check that part of the website out. But the one that's relevant for us here is this one here, PowerPoint slide decks. And when you get to that, you will see a alphabetized list of pretty much all the presentations. There's probably several hundred there. And you scroll down. So you can see right there that popular atheism, whatever that is, has 4 sections to it. So I'm going to give, time allowing, one example out of number 2, number 3, number 4 after a few introductory comments. But I have copious examples of each that you can go, because I get to teach these things in hour-long seminary classes, which, by the way, you can take at Southern Evangelical Seminary. I should do a commercial. You know, get your brother. Is it your brother? That's the okay. Yeah, and come do a commercial for me. I'm being facetious, but I'm being serious. You can actually audit classes for next to nothing. So you get some information from about the seminary back there. So you can scroll through and get all that, all right? Now, what I am doing and was doing is all of the things that are relevant to tonight or this weekend, I'm putting those on a special page on my website, so you don't have to kind of scroll through all of it. So the badge is there. It's already functioning, but it'll take you to a page that's just incomplete. It won't even take you to the page that's incomplete because you can't even load the website right now. So pray for me that I can get somewhere with GoDaddy tonight before the night's over with, all right? So you'll just click on that and just go straight to your own special page, all right? So just a few introductory comments. And if you don't mind, I'm going to rudely, occasionally turn my back to you so I can read off the slide as you do. And that way you have an excuse not to have to stare at me all night long. Few introductory comments. Just some terms that we need to make sure that we are on the same page as I use these terms. For example, the term theism. Theism comes from the Greek word theos, which means God. It's the worldview, if I may use that expression. We're going to talk more explicitly about worldview Sunday night, and I guess grown-ups are allowed to that too, right? Okay, it's not just the kids, but bring the kids. It's the worldview that affirms the existence of God. It's the view that says God exists. That's theism. Now, a term that may be even more familiar is the term agnosticism. Agnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, and it has this negation on the front, this alpha, and so it basically is the suspension of judgment. Technically, you could be an agnostic about any subject, but 99 times out of 10, I did math at Ole Miss, so just if you were wondering how I came up with 99 out of 10, okay? Most of the time in my hearing, when a person says, I am an agnostic, it means they don't know what they believe about the existence of God specifically. That's my experience. So it's the view that says, I don't know whether there's a God. That's what an agnostic. Now, they may say, I don't know and you don't know either, like we can't know, or I don't know and I'm still searching. Give me your arguments. It may be any kind of range of types of agnosticism. And then a term probably the most familiar that we're going to focus on tonight is atheism. You can see the root word there, theos. Sorry, I got that wrong there. I put the wrong one up. So again, I went to Ole Miss. I'm gonna milk this Ole Miss thing out. It comes from the same root word, theos, God, with the same negation. So it basically is going to be the view that says God does not exist. Now we're going to hit this right off here in a moment about whether or not that is exactly what atheism does or doesn't say, because this is part of the debate that's going on between theists. Now, I teach a course at the seminary that ranges from graduate level to PhD level called Contemporary Atheism, where we interact with atheist scholars of today and atheist writers. And so what I've done in the class is divide atheism into three categories. The first is academic atheism. These would be the professional philosophers at like Oxford University's J.L. Mackie, one of the most prestigious philosophical atheists of the 20th century, or Michael Martin from Boston University, or Theodore Drange from West Virginia University. People like that who are the scholars in philosophy that are defending to some degree or another atheism. That's academic philosophy. Academic atheism. Then second is the new atheism. Now, the new atheism sort of run its course in its novelty, so it doesn't get as much headlines as it used to some years ago. But maybe you still are familiar with that if you've never heard that expression. And these were the guys who characterized themselves as the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. Richard Dawkins from Oxford, Sam Harris, who's a philosopher, Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher, Christopher Hitchens, who was a social critic, political commentator. The new atheism. When we talk about, in that presentation, by the way, that you can get, we talk about, well, what's new about it? How does it differ from the old atheism and these kind of things? The third category, then, is basically the topic for tonight, popular atheism. Well, what's going on with that? What is popular atheism? Well, what I mean by the word popular here is that for just about any kind of academic discipline, physics or astronomy or history or whatever, you have this subset of literature that's addressed to the non-technicians. You know, like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a bona fide physicist, but his career often focuses to the non-physicists. So the rest of us can kind of appreciate what physicists do. Einstein even wrote a popular level of his theory of relativity. I got almost halfway through the table of contents on that one before I was, all right, okay, I'm getting a little lost here, Al. But at any rate, so something that is a style of explaining a view that doesn't traffic in the technical jargon that the technicians of that discipline talk in, then that's often called popular. So as the Albert Einstein example perhaps proves, you can be a scholar in an area and still write a popular level in that area. But sometimes popular, I include people who just aren't technicians at all in the area. That would be what would happen if I tried to write a book on the theory of relativity. You go, well, Howe, you really don't know what you're talking about. The little that you do know, you're just repeating what you heard other people say, that kind of thing. So as a genre of literature, you could almost call that popular level, because they're lay people who are writing in some of these things. And that's not always a bad thing. I'm not suggesting because they're not the technicians that their views are always wrong. I'm not saying that. But perhaps there's a greater chance that they're going to understate what's really going on if they're not really conversant. And I think that's certainly the case in atheism, as we'll see, hopefully, as we go along. So who are the popular atheists? Well, there's a lot of them. I'll mention just a few to see if any of them. Now, I've already mentioned Richard Dawkins in the context of the new atheism, so he sort of fits both levels, because his God delusion was a popular level, and Sam Harris, the same thing. So God delusion, the end of faith. In fact, I think that the God delusion, by the way, we live streaming this? This is live streamed, right? Okay, so I should have worked this out with everybody before we got started, but what I love to do when I'm live streaming is just be talking and go, and so we know that wouldn't that be hilarious? They're pushing all these, that GoDaddy or whatever it is, doesn't work. Anyway, but now we can't do it because they all know we're in on it. So these are popular level defenses of atheism. Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, again, these guys I mentioned with the new God is Not Great or Breaking the Spell. George Smith, Dan Barker. George Smith wrote the Atheism, the Case Against God. Dan Barker, Godless. In fact, George Smith, in my judgment, is the best popular level book defending atheism that I've ever read. And that's actually one of my required textbooks in my course on contemporary atheism. He's very well written. He's very thoughtful. He's not shrill and sort of fanatical the way some atheists can tend to be. And some Christians can be that way as well, I admit. But at any rate, Dan Barker, we'll have something to say about him in due course. I had the opportunity to debate him on 2 separate occasions. Michael Shermer and John Shook, I've had the opportunities to debate these gentlemen on different occasions. Shermer's a very, very nice guy. He wrote a book, for example, How We Believe, Science, Skepticism, and the Search for God. And John Shook, The God Debates, 21st Century Guide for Atheists and Believers. So what are the arguments? Here's what I want to do in the time that remains. Is take out my phone and set it right there. So you told me there's a clock somewhere. Is that what that big round thing is right there? Okay, good. The big hands on the 5. Am I doing okay so far? Okay, good. I'm getting there. So what I want to do is I want to give you what some of these arguments are just in one statement. But I'm only going to take 3 examples, 2 if we don't have time, but 3 examples. But I want you to see what the arguments are. So that'll maybe encourage you to go and get the PDF deck, or even better, have me back. I'm always lobbying for a return here. This jury's still out. I realize, okay, we'll do that. So what I do with the arguments is I divide those into 3 categories. Rhetorical arguments. I'll give you some examples, but let me just give you, I'll give you some examples. Let me give you the categories right quick. Rhetorical arguments. These are arguments that sort of are clever plays on words. Scientific arguments. These are arguments that play on issues in the natural sciences primarily. And then philosophical. These are issues that play off of concepts in philosophy, okay? And again, these are popular levels, so they're not the technical things. These are just sort of your rank and file. You could almost think about it as like bumper sticker kind of atheism, T-shirt kind of atheism, right? Coexist or Darwin fish and that kind of stuff. And I'm not critical of that. Those are important ways that we identify with groups and their conversation starters and these kind of things. But that's what it is. And I'll give you even some pictures of some of the T-shirts as we go along. So what are some of these rhetorical arguments? Well, first of all is the one that we will deal with. Atheism is not a belief. Rather, it's the lack of a belief. You hear this all the time. I want to deal with that right off here tonight. But here are others. We are all atheists about most gods. I'm just an atheist about one more God than you. And they'll say, as soon as you understand why you don't believe in the other millions of gods as a Christian, then you'll understand why I don't believe in your God. That's sort of the argument there that I try to deal with. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, whatever extraordinary means in that regard. Science flies you to the moon. Religion flies you into buildings. That is powerful rhetoric. And that's on T-shirts or bumper stickers. That's a powerful rhetoric, I think. Is it an argument for God's existence or lack thereof? Axial tilt, the reason for the season. Some of them are kind of funny, I think. Scientific arguments, what are a few of those? Science is all we need to understand truths about reality, including whether God exists or not. We'll try to deal with that one tonight, God willing. Christianity has reacted against science because science has displaced man from the center of the universe. I used to hear this as a graduate student from various quarters. Well, you Christians are just sort of bent out of shape because science moved you out of the center and you're no longer, the spotlight's no longer on you. Christianity has always stood against the advances of science. The case of Galileo's proof. This is probably one of my favorite things to talk about in this whole 4 sessions that I do in class is the issues with Galileo. The Bible was written by the same people who said the earth was flat. Most scientists are atheists, therefore belief in God is not scientific. Virtual particles prove that something can come from nothing. If God created the biological complexity of the world, he be no less complex. And then philosophical arguments. Question everything. If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. Who made God, or who designed the designer? Atheists can be moral without believing in God, therefore God is not necessary for morality. Christianity requires faith, which is belief in spite of the evidence. Why can there not be an infinite regress of causes in the past? Can God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? You know, this was the very first challenge I ever encountered as a brand new Christian at 16 years old in high school. The sort of village atheist student came up to me and just said, well, could God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? And I was like, I don't know. Because if I say, no, he can't do that, well, he's not omnipotent. There's something he can't do. And I go, well, of course he can make a rock. Oh, yeah, there's something he's not omnipotent because he can't pick up the rock. So either way, your God can't be omnipotent. I'm like, I was floundering there. Why should we think that the cause of the universe is God? All right, so let's take these as time allows. This first one that I mentioned, the atheism is not a belief, rather it's the lack of a belief. Now, these are I got from the internet, artist renderings or even sometimes photographs, that I'm not making this up. This really is T-shirt, bumper sticker kind of almost memes in some respect. Atheism, the lack of a belief in the existence of God. I'm an atheist. You claim that God exists. I don't believe you. It's really that simple. Now, another thing that I do in the presentations that you can get the whole thing is I might give you one or two examples, but for a lot of this stuff, I just have copious examples because I'm trying to prove to my audience that I'm not making this up. This is really what's going on. We don't debate the debate. This is what's being said, and what can we say in response? So George Smith had a debate with Greg Bahnsen. I don't know if you're familiar with Greg Bahnsen, but he was a very prominent Christian philosopher in the 90s. I have dry mouth. Does coffee cause dry mouth? I'm sitting there drinking coffee to cure my dry mouth. You know, coffee causes dry mouth, you idiot. I'm going, I don't know. What's wrong? What problem is it? So in the debate, George Smith said this to Greg Bahnsen. There is no atheistic worldview. Let's be clear about that. Atheism is simply the absence of belief in God. And I'm going to tell you why this matters here in just a second. Keith Parsons, who is a philosopher, says in the book, Does God Exist? The Debate Between Theists and Atheists, which, by the way, if I may be so humble as to toot my own horn, when I was a little tiny graduate student at Ole Miss, back in the the department chairman said, hey, let's organize a debate, because we had one the year before on creation evolution. It was real popular. Let's do another debate. What do we do? Let's do the existence of God. So I helped him organize this debate, and it was that debate there, Does God Exist, that went on the campus. I actually have the VHS videotape. I actually had a hair then. I mean, I still have the hair. It's just like in my shower drain right now. It's not on my head. I still got the hair, though. So Keith Parsons, what does he say in his contribution? After all, atheism means simply the lack of belief in God, and not, as is commonly supposed, the denial of God's existence. So why does this matter? We're quibbling over the quibble. We're debating the debate instead of debating the existence of God. Why are we having this conversation about what atheism means? Here's why this matters. Dan Barker helps us see. Theists claim that there is a God. Atheists do not. That is, they do not claim that there is a God. In any argument, the burden of proof is on the one making the claim. So it becomes a shifting of the burden of proof. So the atheist opinion, at least these guys, is this. You say there's a God, I say there isn't. Give me your case. If your case doesn't prevail, then automatically atheism wins, because I don't have to give evidence that there isn't a God. I just don't have to say anything, because the default is sort of atheism. That's the argument. So it's a dispute over burden of proof. Look at this. My doctor told me I wasn't getting enough hydrogen in my diet, so I drink water now. I just threw that out for the chemistry majors out there. So excuse me a second. Now there'll probably be something like, oh, you should never drink cold water while you're lecturing. Be another kind of thing I'm violating up here. But I have a lot more water than coffee, so I can take a lot more dramatic pauses. There. So it's an issue over burden of proof. And very often the atheist will retreat into, well, I don't have to say anything. You've got all the, I don't have to prove there isn't a Santa Claus. Everybody knows there isn't a Santa Claus. You just have to prove there is. I don't have to prove there isn't a God. Everybody knows there isn't a God, they would say. You just have to prove that there is. So I think that's doesn't work. Here are my reasons. First of all, this definition of atheism conflicts with the standard academic definition of atheism, even by academic atheists, except Keith Parsons is an exception. He is an academic. Paul Edwards, who was an atheist, he was the editor of the 8-volume Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a page-turner, by the way. You want to go get that one, you know, oh, I got to see how this ends. Reading his 8-volume Encyclopedia of Philosophy. According to the most usual definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence God exists expresses a false proposition. Another atheist, Ernst Nagel, atheism is not to be identified with sheer unbelief. A child who has received no religious instruction is not an atheist, for he is not denying any theistic claim. So my assertion is you're revamping a definition that goes against the academics in that very field, even by those who are themselves atheists. Theodore Drange, who is a contemporary atheist philosopher at West Virginia University, says, is the proposition that God exists true or false? You are a theist if and only if you say the proposition is true or probably true. You are an atheist if and only if you say that it is false or probably false. And you are agnostic if and only if you understand what the proposition is, but resist giving either answer, and support your resistance by saying the evidence is insufficient or words to that effect. And then Graham Oppy, properly, we should define theism as the view that there's at least one God, and atheism as the view that there are no gods, and monotheism as the view that there is exactly one God, and we call that one God with a capital G. Atheists then are people who believe that there are no gods, and in particular in our context, they believe that God does not exist. Other people like to say that atheism is just lacking the belief that God exists, which lumps together the class of agnostics with the class of atheists. In other words, he's saying, well, by your definition, then that's just agnosticism if you just don't say one way or the other whether you think God exists. If you define it that way, which I don't like. Now, I don't know if you know who Graham Oppy is. He's an Australian philosopher there. But likely, I suspect you guys have heard of William Lane Craig. You guys know who William Lane Craig is? He's been a hero of mine since umpteen years ago. And when asked, now if you know who William Lane Craig is, he's probably one of the most brilliant Christian thinkers. Doesn't mean he's always right necessarily. He will tell you that. But certainly the most skilled Christian debater out there. And he was asked once, who is the most brilliant atheist you've ever encountered? And he said, Graham Oppy is pretty hard to beat. And I thought that is a ringing endorsement of mental acumen. So I just pile on with his comments here as nobody that has, he doesn't have a dog in the hunt in terms of trying to defend theism. But another problem I have is that the definition entails an absurdity, if not an outright contradiction. I mean, think about it. If an atheist is a person who just doesn't say that God does not exist, but rather just refuses to say that God does exist, you get the subtlety. If that's what an atheist is, then here's what follows. Atheism could be true, and God still exists. In other words, in fact, I think that is the case, isn't it? Is it true that there are people who don't say that God exists? Well, that's true, isn't it? Well, then atheism is true, because that's what atheism is, not saying God exists. Which means, well, then atheism could be true, and God still exists. You think that's what these guys are satisfied with? That they'd be satisfied going, well, in other words, your atheism is completely indifferent as to whether God does or doesn't exist. That just seems absurd to me, if not an outright contradiction. And of course, it goes against the grain of everything you would find up until recently in the literature of the debate between theists and atheists. All right? How about a scientific argument? And by the way, I forgot to say this, but as I ran through the various kinds of arguments from the various categories of popular, if you had a question about one of those others, I'm happy for you to ask. So it doesn't have to be a question about what we explicitly talk about right here. If you thought, well, give me a bird's eye view, the elevator version of this particular thing, I'll try my best to do that. What about a scientific argument? Science is all we need to understand truths about reality, including whether God exists. How about these? Again, these are from the internet. I didn't Photoshop these. These are just artist renderings or photographs of actual T-shirts. Atheists, in science we trust. Science is my religion. So in other words, that's all I need as a human being to know everything that is knowable and is worth knowing about reality, the methods and tools, protocols of science. So Peter Atkins says this: I believe that anything that has been reported reliably, anything, can be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science. Now, you might not know who Peter Atkins is, at least at the time this event went on. This is a clip from a debate. At least at the time that was going on, which would have been the late 90s, he was the author of the most widely used chemistry textbook in the world in universities. So he's a professor of chemistry at Oxford University. This debate is on YouTube. You can watch. It's a debate he had with William Lane Craig at the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia in the late 90s. And my girlfriend, now wife, and I absconded from Charlotte because we were both working for the seminary and drove down to Atlanta, and we're at this debate. I will warn you, if you do watch it, there is one of those scenes. You know how the cameras go into the audience sometimes? They did that, and they're right there on her, on my wife, she's beautiful, okay? But then it pans back really slowly, and then I'm sitting right next to her. So you might want to hide the children, okay, before that part comes up. And so it's hard to be kind of cool, like you're watching the debate, and there's a big camera right there and a big bright light and stuff. I thought about it then. It would have been great to just be like that and just like that. And the guy's going, "Oh, you ruined the whole tape, dude. You just totally ruined it." Anyway, this is what he says in the debate. They were discussing the supposed miracles at Lourdes and whether or not it's even possible that there is a God that could have caused people to be healed. And that's what and he's saying, well, it's possible that they didn't understand that maybe they weren't really that sick, as psychosomatic, or maybe there was a natural explanation that didn't have a scientific explanation then, that kind of stuff. That's what he's saying. So that's what he means. I believe that anything that has been reported reliably, talking about Lourdes, anything can be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. John Shook says this: philosophical naturalism, which is just another term for atheism for all intents and purposes. Philosophical naturalism undertakes the responsibility for elaborating a comprehensive and coherent worldview based on experience, reason, and science, and for defending science's exclusive right to explore and theorize about all of reality. Now, what can we say about these two? What about Atkins? Anything can be reported reliably. Well, I ask, first of all, can Atkins' statement be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science? Now, think about that a second. It's not clear, perhaps, as I pose the question, what do you mean be interpreted in the framework of something? And I think this is really probably not the question to ask. I think Atkins is not really saying what he needs to say. The question isn't whether some reported healing can or can't be interpreted within the framework of modern science. Because I would think you could take any claim about anything and try to interpret it within the framework of anything. You could say, what causes male pattern baldness? And could we interpret that in light of the framework of Lord of the Rings? Just go, okay, I'm not sure what that, but I suppose you could if you tried hard enough. I suppose you could try to cast it in terms of the categories of the Lord of the Rings. As you could, okay, but to me, that's not really the question to ask. The question would be whether or not the statement, any given statement, could be correctly interpreted within a given framework. That's the question. So Atkins didn't even word it properly, because it's not a matter of whether it can be interpreted within the framework. It's a matter of whether it can be correctly done so in the light of that framework. I'm going to try to argue that it can't be, that is, the question of God's existence, or in the context of questions of healing, it can't be correctly interpreted in light of the framework of modern science. All right? We'll see, and I need to go to the next slide before we all have like an epileptic fit or something here. So everybody's just like, to get that blink off. What about John Shook's statement? Philosophical naturalism undertakes responsibility for elaborating and comprehensive worldview based on experience, reason, science, for defending the science exclusive rights of the Lord theory about all reality. Got that in one breath. What can we say about that? Well, take that statement that Shook just said. Is Shook's statement, is that statement a part of reality? Ooh, I almost did it. This is the part where you talk back. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a real statement. He really made the statement. So that statement is a part of reality, right? All of reality. So if that statement is a part of reality, and he's defending science's exclusive right to explore all of reality, then it follows that only science has the right to explore that statement, right? Because that statement is part of reality. So my question is, what scientific method could possibly be used to prove that Shook's own statement is true? What scientific experiment could you do, the conclusion of which is that statement right there? There isn't one. There's no laboratory experiment. There's no observation in space. There's no particle accelerator, the conclusion of which is that statement. So it's self-refuting. He makes a statement to the effect that only science can judge whether things are true, and the thing that he said isn't even provable true or false by the very science he's saying is the only thing that can prove things true or false. So you're just kind of just doing around in a circle. It's a philosophical statement. I know it's self-serving for me to say because my master and doctoral degrees are in philosophy. But I'm not saying that because I have credentials in philosophy. I got those credentials in philosophy because of this kind of stuff. This is what I wanted to try to learn. It was my small little niche to try to say, how can we expose the bankruptcy of these statements, the self-refuting nature of these, and then go on to try to unpack a better response. This is a philosophical statement. So what is a philosophical statement? By the way, very often when I drink water in a thing, I do product placement. So you can just go, your speaker today is being hydrated by Kirkland. Purified water. Now, they're not responsible for the contents of this presentation. So I did that once at our national conference in Charlotte at our seminary, the longest running and largest apologetics conference in the country. And I had a bottle of Dasani, okay? Coca-Cola, right? And I made that joke, and I'm Dasani, and everybody laughed and stuff. And the next day, the second day of the conference, this gentleman came up to me. He goes, "Hey, I loved your Dasani water joke." He said, "I work for Coca-Cola." And I was thinking, so maybe a little, endowment maybe to the conference or something for next year. But he appreciated that nevertheless. So what is a philosophical statement? In this context, to be able to say something about a discipline is generally not a statement from within the discipline itself. Let me give you, hopefully, what I think are a couple of examples. Well, let me save that. Let me make one more point. I'll give you some example here in a minute. What I think both these gentlemen are doing is they're committing a fallacy that is known as the selection effect. What's the selection effect? The selection effect says, for example, if you drag a net through the water of a lake or a river, in order to gather data about the relative sizes of the marine life, invariably any life that is either too small or too large to be caught in the net won't be in your data set. So in other words, the net that you drag through the water is selecting the data. So if you don't factor that into your analyses, you could very well come up with an erroneous conclusion about how big and how small the marine life is because your net was doing that. And I submit to you that we see this fallacy often when physicalists, these are people that think that everything in reality is physical, that physicalists completely miss the evidence for God because they're being scandalized by their own presupposition that all reality is physical. Now, I'm not going to bore everybody with what does it actually look like, how does a physicalist scientist, what are the methods and tools that he might use that you, Richard, think is straining through the water, picking out things, and what is being left out? What does all that look like? We talk about that in some of the courses, these philosophical things. But here's another example of the same thing. What sense would it make for someone to insist that there are no seashells on the beach because his metal detector failed to indicate any? It's like, yeah, well, they're made of like calcium carbonate. They're not made of metal. So if you got a metal detector, you're never going to, no, I'm telling you, man, we've gone all over this beach. And I submit to you, very often these scientists who are atheists, who then decide to talk about the question of God's existence, which, by the way, is a philosophical question, not a scientific question, their methods of the sciences are ill-equipped to even weigh the data one way or the other. That's the allegation that I'm alleging and giving a little bit of evidence for. So let me give you two examples to make two different points. The first is a theological one. We're all theologians here, presumably. Those of you, at least, who are members of this church, the Christians who are present, we're all traffic in theology. So this is a joke that I've heard. It comes in several different forms, where the first guy says, you know, we don't need theology, we just need Jesus. You ever heard somebody say that? We don't really need theology, we just need Jesus. And his friend says, well, who is Jesus? And he says, well, Jesus is, now you're doing theology. So you can't even talk about your need for Jesus without talking about who Jesus is, and then you're doing theology by definition. So it doesn't make sense to say, to sort of divide your relationship with God from theological truths, because you wouldn't even know which God to have a relationship without making some determination about who the true God is versus the false God. So here's the one that's more relevant to the point just made with Atkins and what's his face? I'm drawing a blank here, with Shook. So what good is philosophy? I don't know. What good is science? Well, science, now you're doing philosophy. In other words, science is not the discipline you study in order to study what science itself is in contradistinction to other academic disciplines. The only discipline that has at least in principle, the methods and tools to adjudicate all of the disciplines is called philosophy. That's just what the word is. Now, I would go on to say there's more than that, but it's at least that. I was in a debate at Georgia State University, downtown Atlanta, and I kept making this point about, because the guy I was debating was kind of a scientist, and I kept making this point. The question of God's existence is not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question. You've got to have the tools and methods and protocols of philosophy, not the tools and methods and protocols of science. It's like trying to, say, well, I don't know, does he really love me or not? I don't know, I've got a great app, though, and it'll tell you whether he loves you or not. But you go, that's not how you know whether you're in love with somebody, by some app, all right? It's the wrong way to do it. And so we're having this debate, and I kept making that point. And during the Q&A, this gentleman got up and he said, well, who are you to say that this question is a philosophical question? And I have to admit, I was sort of taken aback by that. Because to me, the question would be like if we were disputing plants. And I said, well, that the deciduous trees lose their leaves every winter and stuff, but the evergreens and it's like that. But after all, that's a botanical question. What sense would it make somebody go, well, who are you to say it's a botanical question? I just go, botany is just the name we give to the study of plants, right? It's not that we said, well, who's going to study the plants? And the botanists are going, we'd love to do that. Okay, let's give them the plants. It was the other way around. It was people that study the plants, and we label them botanists or whatever. So it's not that philosophers are going, we'd like to talk about God's existence. That'd be fun. Let us do that. It's the other way around. The questions about the existence and nature of God historically is an intellectual undertaking that historically humans have labeled as philosophy. It's not the only thing, but it's one of the things. Now, again, I haven't said as much as needs to be said about, well, what does that look like, Richard? But I offer a course at the seminary. See, this is a shameless commercial here tonight, that you can even audit. You don't have to take it for credit or anything, called classical philosophy. All right, so, and that's coming up in October. All the lectures are in 1 week. I don't know why I did my hand like that. That was a signal for 1 week, I guess in some countries perhaps. But all the lectures are 1 week, but you don't have to listen to them all. They're all recorded and archived on our course management system you'd have access to as an audit student. You could just listen to them at your leisure. And we try to go from A to Y, at least, in terms of dealing with some of these fundamental principles of philosophy. All right, our last one is philosophical. What is an argument? Everything needs a cause, or if everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. And you hear this a lot, or at least I hear it a lot. Apparently, it wasn't just the coffee that gives you dry mouth. So I just need to remember not to eat all those cotton balls before I get up. That's a bad habit I've fallen into. So I've heard this a lot in the popular conversation. Well, you say God caused the universe. So if everything needs a cause, and you say everything needs a cause, the universe is a thing, therefore the universe needs a cause, well, then if everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. And so you're right back where you started, so you didn't get anywhere. That's the atheist response. Dan Barker says it this way in his book, Godless. Everything had a cause, and every cause is the effect of a previous cause. Something must have started it all. God is the eternal first cause, the creator and sustainer of life. The major premise of this argument, everything had a cause, is contradicted by the conclusion that God did not have a cause. You can't have it both ways. If everything had to have a cause, then there could not be a first cause. That's what he says. Now, I've got copious examples from both atheists and at least one that I can think of, Christian, who is making this claim, even though he believes in the existence of God. Michael Roos, whom I had the pleasure of debating as well. I can't get along with anybody, Ken. I'm just all these people. I was like, you just don't get along with them. You're just debating all these guys. We debated morality on our campus. I think that's on the website there. And his book, Atheism, What Everyone Needs to Know, he's a jewel. This guy is just a wonderful person, humanly speaking. I hope that, and he really wants there to be a God. I just heard him recently. In fact, it was last night. He had a debate with Paul Copan on a Facebook live stream. And he was like, I hope you guys are right. I want this. I want to live forever. And I was like, man, he seems like he's so prime. So pray for Michael Roos that maybe God can open his eyes as he did and open his heart as he did Lydia as Paul was preaching. What does he say in his book? Again, we find an argument with somewhat different forms, but for our purposes, enough to focus on the central inference. Everything has a cause. There must therefore be a cause of the world. That is, we call this God, that cause. All right, so what can we say about this? Well, this is pretty direct as a response. Among the philosophers throughout history, there is no version of any argument for the existence of God that says everything must have a cause. That argument has never been made by anybody. It's a straw man fallacy. They're refuting an argument that no theist makes. It's never been made. And I'm not saying there isn't some guy in the 8th grade in his pajamas writing a blog at 2 o'clock in the morning that makes this claim. I'm not saying that. No offense to any 8th graders here. I'm not saying that. I'm saying bona fide voices, grown-ups who are informed about the discipline. Nobody has ever said that. What people have said is rather than saying everything must have a cause, one version of the argument for God's existence, or an argument, says that whatever begins to exist must have a cause. That's an argument, but that's not the same as saying everything, because then we would go on as Christians to say, well, God didn't begin to exist. But the consensus among scientists today, as I understand it, is that the universe did begin to exist. So therefore, it needs a cause. That's what the argument is. I would highly recommend Bill Craig's. He's got a lot of publicity tonight. I need to send him an invoice, I think. Say, Bill, you're gonna appreciate me talking about you so much. This book is laugh out loud good, okay? Especially if you have a penchant for mathematics. The Kalam cosmological argument. Again, it's another page turner, I know. Honey, you want to go out for dinner and a movie? Are you kidding, man? I'm reading the Kalam cosmological argument. Leave me alone, man. I'm not going to sleep tonight till I'm done with that one. So what the Kalam is a medieval term out of Islamic philosophy. I think it has something to do with the word reason. But what the Kalam argument tries to do is show that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and tries to show why that cause must be God. So the key premise in the argument is that the universe began to exist. Today, even from Bill, today, most of the time, if you go on YouTube and do Kalam cosmological argument, and people do that, whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and they start to defend the premise the universe began to exist, they will almost always give you the scientific evidence. because I think most people resonate with that. Here's what the Big Bang Theory or entropy or whatever kind of scientific arguments they give. But this version of the book, I mean, this was written back in the 70s. This is an argument for the beginning universe based on an analysis of infinite set theory and transfinite math to prove that the past logically and mathematically cannot be infinite. I'm telling you, you're going to rush out tonight. In fact, I can see some of you right now jumping on Amazon and getting that thing. Get me that Kindle right quick. It is hilarious if you have an interest in mathematics. The thought experiments and the mathematical things from, Cantorian set theory and Hilbert's Hotel, some of you may know what some of this is just really, really remarkable. And his research is just outstanding in that regard. Now, there's another version that hits a lot closer to home for me that says that every contingent being must have a cause. Well, what's a contingent being? It's a philosophical term that basically addresses the difference between a being whose existence can't be accounted for by the nature of that being. That its existence isn't explained by virtue of the kind of thing that it is. The fact that something is a tree doesn't say necessarily anything about whether a given tree actually does exist. You could have trees in your mind that never existed, perhaps, right? You could have people in your mind like Sherlock Holmes. Well, they never existed. You know what he is, but you know that he's not, right? So this distinction between what a thing is and whether it does or doesn't exist, and then whether or not its existence has something to do with the nature of that thing or not, is this whole idea of contingency. So what this argument tries to show, among other things, is that if there is anything that exists whose existence is not accountable by virtue of the nature of that thing, that's only possible because there is a thing whose very nature is existence itself. That its very nature is to be, what the theologians call aseity, or self-existence, and what the philosophers may be called by a lot of different names. And by the way, if I may just defend myself here, that's what my dissertation was on, in Thomas Aquinas' second way, of his 5 famous arguments. His 5 ways are real famous arguments that he gives for God's existence in less than a page. And the second of those 5 is basically this argument from contingency and such. So that's what I tried to defend at the University of Arkansas, believe it or not, which was pretty cool. So Thomas Aquinas is the man there. A book I would recommend to you. It's a fairly modest size, but it's pretty dense. So you may or may not enjoy it, but I think it's very rich. Aquinas' Way to God, the proof in the De Ena et Essentia. De Ena et Essentia in Latin is On Being in Essence, was a little treatise that Aquinas wrote early in his life on being and essence, on the existence and the essence or nature of a thing. And he's discussing essence existence. Now, another thing I like about Gavin Kerr, which I think really commends his book, is that he used to have really long hair and he wore a Frodo shirt. Because I vicariously have long hair through other people, basically, is what it is. Or any hair for that matter. But for some reason, in a lapse of judgment, he cut all his hair off. So I haven't talked to him about it because I don't know him personally. Now, where does this, and I'll end with this thought, and I'll do a little ditty here, a dance. I don't know what that meant. Where does this canard come from? Why are so many people giving a version of the argument that seemingly no one has ever given? And I looked into that a little bit, and I came up with the theory that it's likely that they get it from Bertrand Russell, who was probably one of the most notorious, in a way, famous, certainly, anti-Christian philosophers of the Anglo-American philosophical world in the 20th century. The slide that you saw at the very beginning with the stately gentleman standing at the blackboard introducing me for tonight's topic was Bertrand Russell. So the joke was one of the most profound philosophical atheists of the 20th century was introducing me to teach a course on atheism. That's what the joke was. And he makes this argument in his Why I Am Not a Christian. Now, if you're not familiar with that, until Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion, which came out in like 2008, this treatise is a treatise in this book, was probably more responsible for more Christian college students being disabused of their Christianity than any other one treatise, I think. Was the students go off to college, they read Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian, and they began to doubt whether Christianity is true. And I think since Dawkins' God Delusion came out, it's now taken place. And if you ever heard Frank Turek's lecture, Intellectual Predators, and he gives some interesting anecdotes of pastors' daughters going to college, reading God Delusion, coming home an atheist in 1 or 2 semesters. So this is why you guys care about this stuff, because it affects people that we love, children and others. So, and so I won't bore you with the details, but my short version of that is that Russell misstates the argument because he misquotes David Hume. I think I got a cool picture of David Hume up here. And David Hume, and I'm not sure what the hat thing is all about there. I should have put my Hume party picture. I taught a class on Hume, and we had a party at the end of the semester, and the wife made us all those hats. So I've got a picture. I'll try to find that, maybe throw that in one of the presentations tomorrow there. But David Hume is probably one of the most important, influential treatises on some of these issues is the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion by David Hume. So my theory is Russell misquotes Hume, but Russell is so prominent, all these atheists start repeating Russell without ever doing their own research. Is that even a version of the argument? All right? So the rest of the thing, I won't take the time now. And you can get the slide deck. It's just recommended resources, introductory, intermediate, and advanced on the question of God's existence. All right, so why don't we move into Q or Q&A? How about if I give an answer and then you have to come up with the question? Like Bismarck, North Dakota. And you're going, okay, wait, I got a good question that would be the answer too.
Okay, well, we'll open the floor, and anybody has a question,
You can black that, Zach, if you want.
I will rush to you, and anybody have a question? Okay.
Okay, I've got one. So I think William Lane Craig, since you mentioned him, he said that...
Who?
So I think for him, the hardest issue regarding the existence of God is divine hiddenness. And the example he gave is, why is there not, let's say, a neon pink cross in the sky? So I'm curious what your hot take on that is.
Yes. So I was a version of this in a debate I had with a gentleman named Doug Kruger. We were both doctoral students at Arkansas together. And sort of the inverse of that is, well, what would it take to convince you that there is a God? If you think he's not given the evidence that you think is that you deserve, what would be evidence? So let me say something about that, and then if that's not enough of what you were trying to get at your question, then come back. But so I asked Doug Kruger this, and he said, well, I don't know if the chairs in the room that weren't already occupied just kind of floated up and landed vertical on the back wall of the auditorium and spelled out God exists or something like that. And I thought about that answer, and I thought, well, suppose that happened. Suppose the chairs did that and said God exists. Doug Kruger becomes a Christian theist. Now, he goes out and he tries to propagate theism. And they go, well, I don't believe there's a God. And Doug says, well, what would convince you? And then they said, well, maybe if all the chairs, and this did the same thing, and then that happened. Eventually, then the atheists, if you said, what if all the chairs, Mr. Atheist, floated up on the back wall and spelled God exists, would that convince you? And he'd go, no, that happens all the time. In other words, if the evidence is sufficient to be compelling, then it no longer has the evidentiary sort of oomph to it. If it's sort of narrow enough that it really makes the impact that it's intended to make, then the complaint is it's understating the issue. I've never really been that impressed. Maybe this is a commentary on my psychology. I've never really been impressed with the argument from the hiddenness of God. And in my defense, I would say that a lot of times the reason why I'm a little kind of oblique from what you find in a lot of apologetic circles is because of my commitment to this classical philosophy, this Aristotelian Thomistic philosophical tradition, which I argue in other presentations, undergirded a lot of what we identify as Western civilization. And I think it's because these things are eroding and have been for about 4 centuries that we're fighting battles we could have never imagined fighting. And I know this sounds like a shameless plug, but even among evangelical seminaries, Southern Evangelical Seminary is the only evangelical seminary I know of that champions this classical philosophy in terms of the apologetics. You do find it in other Christian circles, but it's more commonly found in Catholicism. And so, understandably, evangelical Christians get skittish and they break out in a rash when somebody brings up Thomas Aquinas. They start going, Aquinas, that sounds like Catholicism. And they go, it has nothing to do with Catholicism any more than the Trinity is Catholic. You know, it's just that for reasons that wouldn't particularly be interesting to most people, these philosophical foundations began to erode in Protestantism a lot more readily than it did in Catholicism, and we find ourselves. At any rate, I've never been that impressed with the hiddenness of God. In fact, I just saw a debate with Bill Craig where that came up with a guy named, I forget his name now, maybe I'll think about it, and that came up, and Bill, I thought, did a good answer. It's like, well, God will reveal himself to those who sincerely seek. And if the atheist said, I sincerely seek, I go, okay, well, I don't know what else to say. But I believe, based on what I believe is God's authority, that he said that he would do that. And you're telling me that he's not doing that, so that's as far as I can take it. We'll just have to see where it goes from that point forward. Not much of an answer, perhaps, but very good question. All right, we're out of time, so thanks for coming. Zach's got his hand up. I'm sorry, you're on staff. You're not allowed to ask questions.
If Bertrand Russell was so powerful in the minds of the people that he impacted, what did he misquote?
So what Hume said was that everything that exists must have a cause or a reason for its existence. And Russell, this is my theory, when he talks about Hume's challenge, he more or less just says everything that exists must have a cause and moves on from there. And I go, no, if you're quoting Russell, he didn't say everything must have a cause. He said everything must have a cause or a reason. Well, I certainly think there is a reason why God exists, because he's self-existent. He's infinite being itself. He is I am. Remember when Moses said, well, what is your name? He said, you tell the children of Israel, I am sent you. That's my name. And I think it's this sort of nascent kind of theological expression that it took philosophers centuries to try to unpack as to what was nested in God claiming to be the great I am. And of course, Jesus made the same claim about himself, didn't he, in John 8? Before Abraham was, I am. And that's why they picked up rocks. So that's what the misquote was. If I'm right about that, I don't know, but I'm trying to figure out some ways, where did this sort of myth come from? Why would be people saying it when no one's ever made that argument? They're getting it from Russell, because he says that. And I'm thinking he just was careless in his quoting of Hume.
When you referenced earlier...
False. Okay, so I'm sorry.
Thank you. when you referenced earlier where you were distinguishing a statement being a philosophical statement versus a scientific statement,
yes.
What would you say to, and I don't know the buzzword term here, but it's essentially atheistic determinism, which would be, you made this statement based on the neurons firing in your brain, so if we just research more about brain function and activity, we would then determine that your statement was just a product of a scientific process.
Yes. So one thing to be careful about, not you, but us, is that not all atheists are physicalists, or you might be more familiar with the term materialists, thinking that only things that are real are material things. Not all atheism is the same as materialism. So while I think a materialist has that problem, where they try to reduce all events to just the cumulative result of antecedent physical states, so that any given current physical state, like I believe God exists, is reducible to just, again, neurons firing and chemistry, dopamine, epinephrine, and whatever. And so it's not you don't really rationally believe it. I think that is an insuperable problem for the materialists. In fact, some of them bite the bullet. Sam Harris, in his Moral Landscape, in effect affirms an absolute determinism in his attempt to try to defend morality. Now, try to square that circle there. If you don't have free will, how could you possibly have any concept of morality? Because to say something was good or evil is just saying it's either brown or white or 3 pounds or, whatever. It's just a physical state. So I think that's an insuperable problem for these guys, at least for the ones who are the materials. And that's very common with these ones that are the lay atheists. I think they tend to be a sort of a crass kind of materialism. Where you find the more sophisticated non-materialist atheism, like Wielenberg at North Carolina, who has a whole body of literature on morality without it being a materialism and determinism problem raised. There's a great debate between him and Bill Craig on morality. There he tries to be, for those of who care about this stuff, more Platonist than traditional theistic. So he does an in-run around the constraints of physicalism without having to seemingly give in to the conclusions of theism that lie down the road in the argument by running this other Platonic kind of realm. Did that have anything to do with? No, I was asking what your wife's name was. It's like I totally got the question wrong or something.
All right.
Uh-oh. Hold on. Let me take my coat off.
First, quick follow-up question to the first question, if you don't mind. It seems pretty logical to the chair analogy that you gave to say that that wouldn't be sufficient evidence for God, but it also seems that it would be more logical to assume that God exists if he just showed himself in complete physical form, showed his omnipresence, showed his omnipotence, and things like that. And then my own question, I've talked with Christians who believe this, and I bordered on believing this, that it seems quite logical to believe in God for no other evidence than just betting on Pascal's wager. So I was wondering what you think about that as well.
Yeah, so typically Pascal's wager, Blaise Pascal, Christian philosopher, is the idea that if you bet everything that there is a God and there is not, you've lost nothing. But if you bet everything there isn't a God and there is, you've lost everything. And there's a lot of literature and there's a lot of debates about the cogency of Pascal's wager. And I think the weakness of the argument is that it, for whatever strength it might have at some level, it seems to dissipate when you start pressing on the specifics of Christianity versus other religions. So it isn't a matter of, well, if you bet Christianity is false and it turns out it is, then you go to hell. It doesn't follow, well, if you bet that it is and it turns out it's not, you don't go to hell. Well, you do go to hell if Islam is true, right? So all of a sudden now Pascal's wager doesn't really give you anything when it try to adjudicate more interesting questions than merely whether God exists. That is, the questions that begin to involve, but what are his demands on my life? And there, so I've never really been, and there's actually a debate whether that was even Pascal's argument in the first place. And I'm not a Pascal scholar. I did have a student in our doctoral program who was an aspiring Pascal scholar, and he was correct in this all. He says, that's not even what Pascal's argument was. I go, hey, you may be right. I did a little obligatory reading of Pascal as a graduate student and couldn't even tell you what it was because it wasn't my area. So, but anyway, did you want to come back from that, or is that satisfactory? Did I evade your question well enough to? Hey, man, I'm a professional at this stuff. Go ahead. Remind me what it was. I think I lost it.
Kind of the idea that although like physical conjurations of things that may seem as proof to God's existence might not serve as adequate proof for some people if it's a constant occurrence.
Right.
But a physical appearance of God, or like his literal manifestation coming down in some way and showing the powers of God and such, might lend more credibility to the statement.
So
that
I think
God's
that's fair as far as it goes. It doesn't. There's no way to know that it would be that way for any given person. So in other words, it may very well be that for the very guy who says, well, if God just appeared to me right now, I would believe. It may very well be that if God appeared to him the way he wants, it would sort of congeal him even more in his rejection of God. Because as a Christian, I would say there's actually more to the dynamic than just this intellectual part we're discussing. And that is this moral dimension in terms of our aversion to God because of our fallenness in Adam. That's actually a factor. Now, the atheist is not impressed with that element, but I can't help that. I mean, I think that's actually true. So that's how I interpret these things to go, hey, you actually probably are better off that God didn't do that in your life, because if he did appear to you stronger, he knows you're going to be even more recalcitrant. I just wanted to work the word recalcitrant into try to do that. It's not easy, okay? They're going to be even more unyielding in their submission to God, which makes them more culpable and makes their punishment even greater. So it may be an act of mercy on God's part that he's as restrained as he is. And then at last I would say, look, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. This is what Psalm 19 says. I'm astounded, and I'm sure many of you, if not all of you here tonight, are as well. I'm astounded that anybody can go out in a night sky and look up and not know there's a God. I just can't understand. What do you want? There it is. It's just this screaming at you through creation. Paul says in Romans 1:20, the invisible, now listen to how quirky the language is. The invisible attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood through the things that are made. From the things that are made, we can learn that the invisible attributes of God, what I do to tease some of my students to take my class, how do you get from what you can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell to an infinite, all good, all powerful, all knowing, eternal, loving God? How do you get from that to that? And I go, you need to take my class. That's one thing. But you didn't have to take the class. We were talking earlier today. You didn't have to do a lot of this stuff if you go back very many centuries in Western civilization. Nobody didn't know there was a God. The debates, if you go back, were which is the true God? Is it Yahweh? Is it somebody else? Is it Allah or whatever? They were theists debating within themselves who's the true God. But it wasn't that. There's reasons why we're now having to grapple with this kind of atheism. It didn't just pop out of nowhere. And by the way, I would say that about the critical theory. We were talking earlier, some of us even earlier tonight. We sort of rhetorically ask, sometimes people go, well, why does this really matter? I go, that person wasn't asking that. They were talking about how people say that to them. Why does this even matter? And you go, we're dealing with stuff right now we can't avoid. All this gender confusion, and your children are being subjected to this in the public schools. And that matters to everybody. But when that stuff were seeds being planted in academic institutions across America, that's when people are going, well, what does that even matter? It's just a bunch of ivory tower nonsense that these philosophers are going. And so who cares about what Foucault thought of that truth was power? Who can care? Who even knows what that even means? And then here, decades later, now we have this stuff we're having to contend with. These are the fruits that are born on the vines of the seeds that were planted sometimes decades, sometimes centuries ago. Unfortunately for most of us, are largely philosophical and theological. And people aren't, not you, but generally people aren't motivated to want to have to deal with it at that level. But finally, when it gets to where it's in your public schools and your second grade students having to deal with it, now all of a sudden you go, well, what do I do? It's like trying to deal with your lung cancer after 40 years of smoking. It's like, that's not the time to ask. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm going to start preaching here. Pastor, help me get the little hook.
So I have a couple of questions. Answer any order you feel you'd like to. One, in your debates with some of these gentlemen at different venues, do you and how do you incorporate Scripture into any of those debates? And the other question would be, do you run into with any atheists a willingness to believe in multiple little gods but not the one true God?
Let's take the second one. No, I've never really run into any of them that are willing to believe in a lot of little gods rather than... They bring that up as a sort of counterexample to say, Richard, you don't believe in any of these other gods. So the same reason why you don't believe in Thor is why I don't believe in the God of the Bible. That's what they would say, is what I find more often, which tells me that he has no understanding whatsoever of what we are saying about God when we make the claim we make as Christians. We're not talking about Thor is a creature, even in the mythology. We're talking about a being who is the sustainer of the very existence of all the rest of reality. You don't find any god in any of the myths that are that. The closest you might get is Brahman, but even there it's allegorical in Upanishadic Hinduism, for example. And then I conveniently lost I answered the first one, and now I forgot the second one. I forgot the first one. Remind me.
So in your debates, do you incorporate Scripture? And if so, how do you incorporate Scripture with the debates you have with these gentlemen?
So it depends. I try to gauge what is going to be effective with my audience, but I sometimes will do things like trying to show that this issue, for example, existence of God, is something that the Scriptures do address directly, like the Psalm 19 passage, or Psalm 97, the heavens declare his righteousness, and also Acts 14, where it talks about God's providential superintendence of the history of the human race as evidence of God's existence. So in that respect, I bring up that the Bible is corroborative. But very often, the reason I would not necessarily bring up the Bible is it gives the atheist an excuse to go, well, I don't recognize the authority of the Bible anyway, so it's lost on me. And I go, I understand that. I mean, if I was debating a Muslim, I wouldn't be impressed with what the Quran said about X, Y, and Z necessarily, unless the debate was Quran versus Bible, for example. But over the years, I've confined myself to really two narrow things that I feel confident enough to debate, and that is the existence of God and then the questions of God and morality. And then some of these other things, those titans out there in apologetics that take on, I go, okay, I'll let you guys take on that stuff there. But yeah, it's sort of a judgment call in terms of just the tactics one wants to implement that'll have the most force and compelling. And really, for the most part, your target is the audience, not your opponent. You're trying, because look, Proverbs recognize really three kinds of people, more than three different words. But you've got the fool. There's nothing going to make a fool wise, and you've got the wise. But what's interesting is the simple. That's the person in the middle. When the wicked, another word for fool, when the wicked are punished, the simple are made wise. It doesn't say when the wicked are punished, the wicked are made wise. So that's why the deterrence debate is like, no, nobody, the debate isn't, well, does capital punishment or any kind of punishment deter the criminal? No, it's not aiming at the criminal. It's aiming at the person who's not a criminal yet. And he sees, well, that's what happens if you do that. I don't want to go down that road. So I may not have any hope that, except by God's grace, of course, that I'm going to have any impact on Dan Barker or John Shook or Michael Shermer or any of these guys. But there may be somebody in the audience who's just like, I don't know what to think about this. I mean, that kind of happened to me. I lost my faith as a college student. I wasn't raised in the church. I got saved at 16. I studied enough music in college to annoy everyone around me. And then I went to our flagship denominational school, and my first encounter with biblical skepticism among the theologians in the religion department, and lost my faith. And it was apologetics, people like Norman Geisler, who co-founded our seminary, Josh McDowell, some of these names, R.C. Sproul. It was people like that brought me back to the Lord intellectually, to know why I believed what I believed rather than just what do I believe, but I began to believe why. So I think of a person like me that might be out there that's sort of waffling, that I can, by God's grace, be used of him to help that person, at least to consider some of the resources. I'm pointing like that screen is still up there, but you guys remember that. Any rate, so yes. We got one right here. Lady, get the mic there because we don't want the home viewers to miss out on your question.
How would you address an assertion by an atheist or an agnostic that, and obviously they don't have a scriptural, they don't believe Scripture is truth, that says, if you have a loving and powerful God, why is there suffering in the world? Or he's not powerful enough.
Absolutely. Well, I like this question for several reasons. One, 3 of the most significant questions in apologetics today, the way we have those discussions today, are framed the way David Hume brought those issues up. Now, he wasn't the first person to bring them up, but the way he brings them up in his literature sort of form the contours and template of the way we have that discussion today. And one of them is that very issue called the problem of evil. If God is all powerful, he could prevent evil. If he's all good, he would prevent evil. But evil is not prevented. Therefore, there can't be this God. And I do an extended presentation on that because I think you can make the argument even stronger for the atheist side. And I add that into my argument for them before I try to go back and give a response. And the short answer is that, and I had to learn this as an apologist, is that, okay, so the atheist doesn't grant the authority of the Bible. That's fine. But that doesn't mean you can't quote the Bible, because sometimes people can be convicted by God's Holy Spirit, irrespective of what they think is an authority, right? So there's no downside to quoting the Bible. But when let me see if I can regain my train of thought, and I'll grab a strategic. When you're talking about evil, there are several issues that I think are sort of floating around that have to eventually be addressed in order to do it. And this is the one that I think is directly relevant to the way you frame the question, is that when you can quote the Bible, and that's fine, but what I had to learn as an apologist is not to be intimidated to think that I couldn't call from my entire Christian worldview as part of my answer. In other words, I didn't have to say, well, since you're not a Christian, I can't use this as part of my response because you don't really I'm going, no, this is my answer to it. For example, the Christian view of reality is this is not the only life there is. This is just part of the story. And so, in a sense, there isn't an answer if you confine the question of, well, why doesn't God do something right now in this life about evil? And as a Christian, I would go, well, there's no answer to that. But that's not what we think's going on. We've got this life as an antecedent and preparatory of the next life. So now it's the entire equation that I'm responsible to try to give a coherent defense of, not just a subset of it, that I can somehow defend. In creating us was not just to make us happy in this life. That's not and that's sometimes not to trivialize the issue of suffering, but happiness in this life is not what we are advocating as Christians. It's happiness in eternity. That's what we're advocating. And so then that begins to get in the whole issues of consequences of actions and sin and punishment and these kind of things too. And then last, I would say, just make a reference to, I think one of the most neglected elements in this morality discussion is natural law theory, which Protestants have unnecessarily abandoned for several centuries. What got Clarence Thomas in trouble when he was being confirmed, because he seemingly said something about it. So another shameless plug is a book that just came out called The Morality Wars, debates over the origins of human goodness. And I have a chapter in there on natural law. It's a bunch of atheists and Christians and such giving different perspectives on human good and existence or non-existence of God. So I have a chapter in there, Laws of Nature and Nature's God, entitled them, A Decent Respect for the Opinions of Mankind Require that they should give a reason which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We all know that part. But that's preceded by this reference to the laws of nature and nature's God. Well, laws of nature there isn't merely gravity and all that kind of stuff. It includes that, but it's not just that. It's moral law. And the argument in natural law theory traditionally, starting from in kind of undeveloped in Aristotle, comes to its zenith in Aquinas, is that there are truths about morality that can be rationally demonstrated to human beings by human reason, irrespective of whether you believe there's a God necessarily or believe that anything else about the Christian faith. And I would argue it's part of the way that God superintends the nations of the earth, that there are moral truths that people can't fail to know, except because of the fall. We can get so corrupt that we can't see something. But I'm saying just rationally speaking, that's what natural law theory tries to advocate. I'm a big fan of this value in public moral discourse, sanctity of marriage, sanctity of life, for example, human rights, and these kinds of things. Cut me off here, Pastor. I'll leave it up to you. I don't have anywhere to go. My plane doesn't leave till Monday, so
I'll do. This is my son, so I can't cut him. Well, I guess I could cut him off, but.
So I did debate all throughout high school, and I love these type of debates. But obviously, this debate's been going on for thousands of years, and so
they haven't. Yes, they have. No, they haven't. No.
Yeah, I think my struggle a lot of the times is how do we take it from having a debate and these intellectual arguments and intellectual experiments where there's always going to be a new atheistic argument, there's always going to be a new theistic response, and how do we convert that to actually having real discussions with people and getting past just this kind of intellectual experiment, and we need to actually change your life?
No, this is a great question, because that's really what it's about, isn't it? We're in the business of go ye therefore into all the world and make disciples. That's the agenda. The debates, in my judgment, are just one of several mechanisms that ignite the conversation. But what needs to happen, I think, to your point, is that for as much as we can, that conversation that's ignited at the debate needs to now take a personal kind of form in personal relationships. So it's sort of like lighting matches. But of course, you don't want to just light matches. You eventually want the heat to cook food so people can live, right? And so we're saying, well, eventually, we got to get to where we're cooking. Yes, but we don't need to stop lighting the matches. Otherwise, there won't be the heat there to cook the food to feed the people. Now, that may be kind of a silly illustration, but I think there's a place for these things. So it's not that the same debate keeps happening with the same person over the thousands of years. It's that thousands of people strewn out the centuries are having these debates over and over again anew. So as a teenager, when I started hearing these debates, even though the debates had been going on since Aristotle, in a sense, they were brand new to me. I had never heard them until I heard them at this point. But and you weren't saying this, but if somebody said, you know what, this has been going on for thousands of years, we need to retire this and move on, I wouldn't have heard the debate ever, and I never would have gotten ignited, and the match would have never been lit. So I'm sort of an advocate of both. And that's self-serving in a way, because I do the former professionally. I teach students how to be involved in this stuff and teach people how to access resources. But I need people like you and others in my life to help me not lose the vision of this. Don't forget why we're doing this. We're trying to win people, not arguments, right? But we don't want to not have arguments. So it doesn't follow that because I'm not trying to merely win arguments, that I'm not trying to ever win arguments. It's just that I'm not trying to merely do that. I'm trying to win arguments as a means of winning people when the occasion warrants, obviously.
Let me do this last one, because Dan, you had your hand. You sure? Yeah. Okay. Because it is getting a little late, and he's got 2 sessions tomorrow. Oh,
what?
My goodness. Everybody's got questions. What? Why is people pointing at me? Did I miss somebody? I know there was lots of questions. Do you want to do one more?
Listen, as I said, my plane doesn't leave till Monday. Okay. You're in charge here, so I'm here.
No, I've just lost being
I'm
in
here
charge,
to serve you, because that's how.
In your experience in interacting in these debates and with the atheists, how would they respond? Let's just say we had all these atheists on the stage, and everybody in this room that could testify to a changed life, would just, let me tell you my story, and you share your story of, I was once this way, I'm now this way,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do they respond to that, or how do they explain that? Because to me, that's the thing with Christianity, that stories have changed lives.
Absolutely.
you know, to me, is such a proof of the existence. I don't see too many atheists going, well, you know, I was once miserable and now I'm even more miserable. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
so
Yes.
how would they respond?
So, as I'm trying to think about responses I've heard in general, I think they are going to just come back to go, look, they could tell you of Buddhists who have had changed lives, or people in the cults, and the Heaven's Gate cult. Have you ever seen the documentary? Remember the Heaven's Gate cult, that the guys that thought that Hale-Bopp comet was going to come take them to the level beyond heaven back in the mid-'90s? And they had changed lives. You watch the YouTube video and of these people, and they are just overwhelmed with tears of joy because of what, and of course, within a few days of that video, they're all committed suicide. So these atheists will point to that to say, well, you've got all kinds of testimonies from all the religions, and to these atheists, they just all sound alike. Now, the fallacy they're committing is this. If you go up to a group of inmates in a prison, and one of them says, I'm innocent, likely the response is going to be, they all say they're innocent. To which I would go, yes, but just because they all say they're innocent doesn't mean that some of them aren't actually innocent. Of course, the guilty are going to say they're innocent, but just because the guilty says they're innocent doesn't mean that when the innocent say they're innocent, it's false. So just because we've got religions that may foster a changed life that we as Christians say is a false religion and is going to lead to their eternal misery, just because we say that doesn't mean our claim that our changed lives is on our way to eternal happiness is false. That's a fallacy that the atheist is making in that regard. They're just the person that goes, well, every inmate thinks he's innocent, and they just go away and go, every religion thinks it changes lives. Yeah, but there's one religion where that changed life is not just in this life, it's in eternity. Now, I will also admit that in some people's lives, or some people's experience, their Christianity didn't seem to change their life in this life, because as soon as they converted, they were beheaded, let's say. They didn't have time to have a... They look, well, look at this guy. He became a Christian. They cut his head off. Who wants that? Right? So that's why I say, well, yeah, but our worldview includes the afterlife. So a changed life can be a powerful testimony, I think. But be prepared for some people to just go, I've heard the changed life thing. Mormons talk about changed life. They're not Christian. So lots of religions have that. In fact, almost every religion that I know, even Satanism does, believe it or not. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to denigrate the testimony. It's always a great relationship builder, and people begin to explore. You know, with the passage you quoted and you started us off, so this is a great recapitulation there, little music term that I just threw in right there. But when Peter is saying that, you know, to be ready to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, you have to ask yourself, well, why would Peter expect his readers to be asked a reason for the hope that is in them? Why? Because his readers were exhibiting to their fellow Romans and Jews, they were exhibiting something in their life that gave them hope. How are you able to endure and hope when everything is so oppressive around us? And they go up to him and say, what is the reason for the hope that is in you? And the reason for the hope that is in them is the resurrection from the dead. That was the reason, of which they go, then you want to give an account for that hope and that reason. How do you know there's a resurrection? Why should I believe it? That kind of stuff. And that's apologetics.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Howe. That was phenomenal.
You're welcome.
And Thor, I do believe in your existence, just to let you know.
Yeah, sorry.
Of all the gods to just throw out there to say you don't believe in their existence.
I had to pick. Maybe that's why, because we had talked earlier.
Yeah,
exactly.
On the second row.
Yes, exactly.
I could tell he looked at his son and like, I guess I don't exist.
Yeah, I guess
I
I don't.
know what to do.
It's like,
Anyway. But tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock, we have 2 more sessions with some Q&A. We hope to end by about lunchtime. Relativism and pluralism, you may think, well, I don't know if I'm interested in those, but anytime you hear live your truth or the tolerance and coexist, that's all the same.
Or hotty-toddy.
Who?
No, never mind. I was trying to gin up the enthusiasm to get it. Never mind.
What did you even say? I didn't
You explain it to him later, okay? Yeah, there you
a
go.
hottie toddy? What did you say?
It's a reference to Ole Miss.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Anyway, so thank you all for being here. I'm going to close in a word of prayer. And like I said, tomorrow morning we're going to kick in again. And again, thank you for being here, brother.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Father, we just thank you. Thank you for your grace. And again, remind us, as we've just talked about, it's not the goal is to win arguments, but to win people. But Father, equip us so we can give a reason for the hope that's within us, and equip us so we can see the roots of some of the arguments that are made, and we can give a reasoned response for your glory. And so, Father, thank you for Dr. Howe. Give him a good rest, and may he continue to equip us and encourage us tomorrow morning. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Lead us in